Even with summer in full swing, the politics of Alberta and Canada continue to march on. There have been a lot of developments recently with Canadian censorship and the Liberal government wanting to keep their coalition alive as well. Then there's the ideology of the current federal Liberals and the reaction from the business world and Canadians themselves. To talk more about Alberta and the nation of Canada, we are joined by Josh Andrus. He's the Executive Director of Project Confederation. Josh, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Now, thinking of the recent Sustainable Jobs Bill, or Just Transition as it was previously called, do you see any steps that the current Canadian government taking to address the concerns and grievances of Albertans regarding the province's role in the national economy?
To put it bluntly, no. I mean, this has been an
Wow.
issue since the federal Liberals were elected in 2015. They brought in a tanker ban, immediately banning all exports of oil effectively off the coast of northern BC. They've brought in the Impact Assessment Act, otherwise known as the No More Pipelines Law, which is actually more encompassing than that. It effectively gives the Liberals final veto power on major projects, not just on energy, but it could be a gravel pit in Stettler. This is being challenged
Wow.
in the Supreme Court by the Alberta government with 8 other provinces intervening on Alberta's behalf. The federal government has zero support from the provinces on this. The Sustainable Jobs Act is just another step in the direction of completely dismantling Western Canada's energy sector. There aren't policies coming in to limit the number of cars on Ontario freeways. There aren't policies coming in to limit the ability of some of these, like a Quebec concrete company, from polluting the St. Lawrence. They're bringing in legislation that's directly targeting Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I think it's specifically because we don't vote Liberal. The Sustainable Jobs Plan there was a leaked memo from a Blacklock's reporter obtained it from the internal government memo that said Alberta will lose 187,000
Wow.
jobs if the federal government moves forward with the Sustainable Jobs Act. They've now renamed what was called the Just Transition. They can't even use the terminology because of the negative connotations that comes with economic development in even a developed country as Canada, where we bring in a policy that's effectively going to drive costs up. Not only are they bringing in these policies designed to attack our industries, they've also extended the equalization formula for an additional 5 years in a recent Ways and Means motion. It was a 400-page document. The equalization renewal was 198 pages in. It was barely noticed. It's one of those things where we're happy to contribute to the development of the rest of the country, but we need to be free to do it. And if we're not free to do it, then why are we helping? I think that's really the basis of the frustration here. So no, the federal government does not care. We had a referendum in Alberta to eliminate equalization from the Constitution, eliminate the principle of it from the Constitution. It was supposed to trigger some kind of a negotiation. Not only has the federal government ignored it, they have actually extended the formula for an additional 5 years without consultation from the provinces. Finance Minister Nate Horner was on record saying that this is unacceptable. So this is something that is going to be an overarching issue through the summer as we head into the legislative session in the fall. It's going to be very interesting to see how fast the Liberals move on the Sustainable Jobs Act, especially given the pushback from primarily Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Now, you mentioned equalization as well as the Sustainable Jobs Bill, and a lot of oil and gas revenues pay for a lot of needs that Canadians have. So, in your opinion, do you think that there's a plan or idea of how Canada can make up the revenue shortfall if Canadian oil and gas sector was deleted?
No, I think this is poorly thought out. I think this is going to lead to job losses across the country. I mean, the energy industry, you have to remember, is the industry that powers every other industry. Without affordable energy, we can't have economic development. We actually could see the economy move backwards. Energy, because of its influence in price mechanisms. I mean, every product that you uses energy when it's being produced, when it's being built, when it's being transported, and then when it's on the shelf at your grocery store or the store it's purchased at needs electricity to run. So by increasing energy costs across the economy, it's going to increase prices. And if you see that combined with increasing unemployment, it's going to lead to a deep recession across the country. I don't think this is well thought out. I think this is absolutely terrible policy coming out of the federal government, but it's nothing new. We've seen this before. It's been going on for the past 7, 8 years here since the Liberals were elected. So it's going to be something that we're keeping an eye on for sure. Right now, Alberta's economy is the strongest in the country. Our immigration is the strongest it's been since 1914. We've seen the population grow. So we're in a unique position where we currently are doing okay, but to see the federal government plan on bringing in policies that, according to internal government memos, are going to phase out 187,000 jobs, that's going to have a devastating impact across this province. And I think it's going to enhance an already simmering cauldron of Western alienation.
Now, we've talked about revenue, but also the workforce too would be impacted, because we need to remember that removing Canada's oil and gas industry will affect airline pilots and camp workers, cooks, bus drivers, mechanics, janitorial, maintenance staff. Like, the list just goes on and on and on. It seems endless that the ramifications of the Sustainable Jobs Bill will affect like every sector of the Canadian economy. So do you think the government has really thought this through?
No, I mean, obviously not. I mean, this is based on sound economic theory too. I mean, we're seeing aggressive policy pushes. Alberta, like Canada, as a net contributor to, or sorry, as a contributor to CO2 conditions, we're a carbon sink. We've got lots of trees. Our energy industry is ethical. We're moving towards carbon capture technology, but they're pushing ahead before the technology's there to actually combat it. Not to mention, we're seeing other jurisdictions like China and India increase the amount of coal-fired plants. Like, to me, we've got a government that's acting ideologically without really analyzing the impacts that we have, that's doing something to be able to say it's doing something. And we haven't even seen how much of an impact it's going to have when you have two of the world's largest economies and populations bringing in coal-fired plants. Like, to me, it's short-sighted and foolish, and it's going to have devastating consequences for the Canadian economy.
Now, one of the frustrations that Albertans have is they feel that Ottawa is making decisions that benefit Ontario and Quebec, but definitely not Alberta. So what specific policy or constitutional changes does Project Confederation advocate for to enhance Alberta's influence and autonomy within Canada? And how do you envision these changes positively impacting the province and its residents?
Well, first of all, we need free trade across the country. I mean, that's something that is supposed to be enshrined in the Constitution. Section 121 reads, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, but it effectively gives each province the ability to trade freely with another province. However, we've seen an activist Supreme Court, which is a common story throughout Canada's history, effectively rule against that, where they're giving the provinces the ability to block trade. We'd like to see clarification on the constitutional clause that gives free trade. I mean, do we have free trade or do we not? A second one is the ending of the equalization program. We think that it needs to be abolished. We think that it creates almost a welfare trap in some of the have-not provinces where they're reliant on revenues from the rest of the country to stay afloat and don't incentivize economic activity. Like a fishery or something like that off the coast of maybe Newfoundland, or an oil refinery somewhere in Eastern Canada, right? Like, so we're at the point where these are two absolutely awful policies that they're contributing to economic, weakness across the country. Not to mention, we have, like, for example, employment insurance. Alberta, through the 2015 to 2020 recession, give or take a year, we contributed every single year, even though our unemployment rates were the highest in the country. We are still a net contributor to unemployment. So that needs to be changed. We need to opt out of certain federal programs in exchange for tax points. I think the Alberta government could do a really good job of providing some of the services that are constitutionally in our jurisdiction, but are being run by the federal government based on conditional transfers. So if we opt out of the conditional transfers and get tax points instead, it gives our tax base the ability to provincially raise the revenue here and provide the services, which I think we can do better at a local level than the federal government can.
And collaboration and partnerships between provinces are crucial for Canada's success. So how does Project Confederation envision leveraging interprovincial relationships and fostering cooperation between Alberta and other provinces to address common challenges and achieve our shared objectives?
Well, it's interesting because as the federal government has centralized political control, we've seen provinces push back. Like right now, we're seeing it with in the Maritimes, for example. Atlantic Canada is standing up to the climate agenda because, again, it is about their ability to raise revenues internally. It is about their ability to provide good economic conditions for investors and job creators so that they can build the economy. We're seeing BC start to push back against certain areas in healthcare, right? Ontario has almost liberalized the use of the notwithstanding clause against the prime minister's wishes. So what you're seeing is pushback from provinces across the country, and you're starting to see collaboration at premiers meetings. There was one earlier this month late last month where Premier Danielle Smith met with all the other premiers, and there does seem to be a great degree of interest in collaboration. I think that's a great starting point to start to have the discussions that we need around how this country works, because the federal government is not only doing a bad job of delivering policy, but it's also centralizing control and taking away jurisdictional control from the provinces. And I think that's an issue that most provinces are starting to realize is something they're not just going to have to keep an eye on, but they're going to have to get actual changes for.
And do you feel that there are specific strategies that will be effective in garnering public support and promoting constructive dialogue on Alberta's role within Canada?
I think the government's done a good job of advocating on behalf of what Canada wants. And I do think that part of the reason that our migration patterns over the last year or so extensively in Alberta's favor, where we're seeing inflows from other provinces, is that the government's done a good job of actively building an economy that creates jobs. I think that's something that other provinces are realizing as their people are leaving, that they should probably start to focus on. And I think that part of the issue is, like, I think that provinces are wanting to see more decentralization, that they want more control. And I think that's something that, if we're focused on collaboration, focusing on the idea of decentralized control and giving provinces more autonomy over their own jurisdiction, is something that is catching on. I mean, it's always been something that Quebec wants. I mean, we've got an ally right there. Ontario is pushing back on federal centralization. The Maritimes are pushing back. I think decentralization and provincial autonomy over their own issues, over their own constitutional jurisdiction, is something that's going to be a uniting factor as we move forward, especially in the wake of the just transition and some other federal policies that are just going to drive costs up on consumers.
So, Josh, you mentioned Quebec, and when you think of Quebecers and Albertans, you don't necessarily think of them being the best of friends. But tell me, Josh, what have you heard from Quebec on Alberta's increasing desire for autonomy? Are they supportive of it?
So I haven't seen any comments directly from the Quebec government, but I do know that François Legault has been pushing for a much more autonomous agenda in Quebec on cultural issues. I mean, Alberta is more of an economic focused kind of a push, but Quebec does have a unique culture. I don't think anybody's going to deny that. He did that because he wanted to kill off the Parti Québécois. Now, he failed to do so. The Parti Québécois won a handful of seats in the most recent Quebec general election and have been rattling the cages of Legault from inside the Quebec National Assembly. They refuse to swear allegiance to the king, which is constitutionally mandated in the Constitution. They've been pushing for more reforms. Now, I go to conferences across the country, and I do talk to people from Quebec, political activists from Quebec. And most of them come up to me and say, man, I love what you guys are doing in Alberta. Like, you guys are basically following the Quebec agenda. They call it sovereignty association. They want to be a part of the country, but they also want sovereign control over their own constitutional jurisdiction, which is exactly what Alberta is pushing for. And I think you're going to start to see that that narrative tie the two provinces together, especially if we get to a constitutional negotiation where we do want to see certain powers that the federal government have passed back to the provinces. Employment insurance, like I mentioned earlier, is an area that Quebec has been pushing for. They even went so far as to create their own parental leave agency where they, with an agreement with the federal government, have control over parental leave in the province. So that's an idea that Alberta is potentially exploring, where we do have a lot of overlap in our policy agendas. And it's very interesting. Yeah, there is some frustration in Alberta towards Quebec, especially over equalization. But I think there's an appetite in Quebec to see equalization payments decrease in exchange for more autonomy over their own provinces, over their own affairs.
But all we've talked about today, it really does boil down to vision and leadership. So tell me, Josh, who do you think Canada's next Preston Manning is?
So I had to think about this. I don't think there's any single individual that is going to be the next Preston Manning. I think the power that we have now is that there's a lot of voices at the table. It's not just Danielle Smith. It's not just Scott Moe. You've got Doug Ford. You've even got Francois Legault talking about more provincial autonomy. You've got a very like it's coming from everywhere, and I think the more voices that we have on this issue, the better. I also think that part of the reason that we didn't succeed with reform in getting some of the changes we needed is because we tried to build it in a political party, a federal political party, and the provinces weren't really engaged in that. And I think that led to some issues. So I think that the approach that we're taking by having it come from the provinces is really the key here. If we focus on it, trying to change things within the federal Conservative Party or within a reform, or creating a reform party, I think that creates issues where you almost end up with a Liberal government for longer. I think pushing back from the provinces, especially when the federal government does have such a strong centralization ideology, really. I mean, they want control. I think that's really where the change is going to be. So, like I said, I don't know if anybody's going to be the next Preston Manning, but I think that the strength that we have now is in our numbers. And as our numbers grow, we're going to get much more pressure on the federal government, pressure on the constitutional structure of the country. And if we get that, we can actually sit down and have a strong discussion about what changes we want.
Well, Josh, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. That was great.